There are certain shapes that come up again and again in quilting. One of those is flying geese. Some people love them, other people find them challenging, but I always find them visually appealing, and that's what we're working on in this episode of How to Quilt. Flying geese can be made in a number of different ways. For this version of the block, we're going to make the most traditional technique, but if you upgrade to How to Quilt Premium, I'll show you a whole alternate technique to make a flying geese block that makes 4 flying geese at a time. We don't actually need 4 of the same color anywhere in the block that we're making because we're going to use 4 different fabrics plus a background fabric to create a flying geese block that has real movement to it, but without any really tricky techniques. We're going to draw some lines, we're going to sew on the lines, we're going to put it all together, easy peasy as you please. Come on. Like our quarter square triangles for our Ohio Star block, we're going to use our marking tool on these flying geese blocks in order to stitch our seams. We start with all of our fabrics. I've got that same sort of medium gray color, our school busy color, the lighter of our blues, this aqua, and the darker of our pinks, along with our wasabi green. There are 2 of each of these rectangles. These form the basis of the blocks that we're going to be making, and they're slightly larger than what we want the finished piece to be. And then we've got our 16 squares. So 2, 4, 6, 8 rectangles. 16 squares is 2 square per rectangle. So I'm going to start with sort of any of them. It really doesn't super matter. There's my rectangle. Here's 1 square. Place it right sides together. Again, I'm using solid fabrics. If they were printed, it would be printed fabric to printed fabric, right sides together. Raw edges even on one end. So it extends a little past halfway here, but everything's right sides together and lined up. And then I'm going to take a ruler, and it's a smaller ruler because I'm working with smaller pieces. And again, you can always line up a straight edge there to make sure you're getting everything just right, or you can kind of eyeball it so the edge of my ruler goes through the corners here. And I've drawn a line. Now, the difference between this and when we did our 2 at a time half square triangles, if you think back, we drew a line and then we stitched a 1/4 inch away and a 1/4 inch away. For this piece, we're going to stitch on the line all the way across and then trim the excess away before opening the corner out. Press your foot down. The needle is lined up directly with our chalk line. And we stitch directly on the line. Once we've stitched, trim your threads, just because it's nice to be tidy. And then we're going to cut it off. You can do this with your rotary cutter if you want a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance, or you can do it with your scissors. And then we're going to press away from the rectangle. Toward the square. Back at the cutting table, we repeat. So another square, separate square, and you're going to notice it overlaps just slightly. This allows us to come back and sew a 1/4 inch seam here later, but still preserve the point of this flying goose that we're making. So I'm going to allow this to overlap, use my tool, and go corner to corner. Draw another line and then come back and stitch again. Back at machine, press your foot down, lining up at that point. If your machine, if it chews, you know, some machines, when you get the needle that close to the edge, it'll kind of drive it down into your throat plate. You can start a little further and then back stitch to catch that bit if you need to. And then we trim and we press. Got our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Trim everything off. And then we're going to press toward the square, opening out those seam allowances. So there's that overlap right there at the top here. that gives us space for our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now remember I said we made this slightly oversized? What we want is a 6.5 inch by 3.5 inch rectangle so that we can make our 12.5 inch block, right? So 6.5 plus 6.5 minus the seam allowance is 12.5. So that's what I'm shooting for, but I clearly have more than 6.5. This is 6 3/4, maybe pushing 7, and more than 3.5 going this way. So I need to trim it down. The trick is trimming it down in such a way that this stays even and we don't lose our point. And I don't very often recommend specialty rulers necessarily, but this particular one is really great. If you love flying geese and think you're going to make a lot of them, or if you don't love flying geese and they really frustrate you like so much, it's such a great tool to use in order to cut them better, right? So it's got markings on it, so 6.5 and then 3.5, so that I can line up all the different segments of my block and trim it down to preserve my 1/4 inch seam allowance, but also my points on the lower edge. So I'm going to start by putting this little chicka 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 here, and then my rotary cutter, and I'm going to trim and trim, and then I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to line up my 6.5 inch here with my 3.5 inch here, and you can see my points come, and I'll trim it off again, whoopsie, without letting it slip, hopefully, so that when I flip it back over, I get that perfect 6.5 by 3.5 trim, but my point right here is preserved after I take out that 1/4 inch seam allowance. It is totally possible to do this with a standard ruler as well, but it becomes your job to watch for that 1/4 inch at the top there so that you can make sure you get exactly the measurements you want. Either way, whatever ruler you happen to use, this is what we're making. We're going to need 2 of each color, which is to say 8 total. And this is another great opportunity to chain stitch at the sewing machine. I'm ready to start laying my quilt out and assembling my units. Because we're making 12-inch finished blocks for the How to Quilt video series sampler quilt, you're going to see a lot of numbers repeated. 3 and 6 are the most common. 3.5 inch squares, when combined, measure 6.5 inches after they're sewn together and we deduct our seam allowance, which means that 2 3.5 inch squares takes up the same amount of space in a 12-inch quilt block as one 6.5 inch rectangle. When we look at the flying geese units that we just constructed, each one is a 6.5 inch rectangle. They are 3.5 inches tall, which means that 2 6.5 inch rectangles put together makes a 6.5 by 6.5 inch square unit. We're going to combine those units together to make our 12-inch finished block out of our 4 different colors of flying geese. I'm going to all of this effort in order to continue to encourage you to think about the ways in which you can take the elements, the units of different quilt blocks, and mix and match them cafeteria style. So now we have our 8 flying geese units. We are going to combine those first into 6.5 by 6.5 inch squares, and then by rows into our finished block. With the segments that I've made, each of these flying geese, I'm going to assemble the different units for the block, which are really quadrants. So if 6.5 by 3.5 plus 6.5 by 3.5 makes 6.5 by 6.5. And then 6.5 plus 6.5 makes 12.5. You can start to see how this is sort of a quadrant for a 12-inch finished block. My job is to assemble each of these flying geese into the quadrants according to the diagram in the pattern. So I'm going to take each of my matched colors, right sides together, and take them to the machine and stitch them, watching for that intersection of threads. We've trimmed all of these very carefully to preserve these points at each tip of our triangle here, and I don't want to lose them as I'm assembling my units. So I'm going to watch for that intersection of threads again and put these all together. By this point in your quilt making career, you are fairly accustomed to what comes next. We're going to come to the iron and press. I'm pressing the point of this flying goose toward the base of the other because I want to think about managing this bulk for later. I have to quilt over each of these seams. If I go this way, I'm folding the point back on itself, but this is a single piece of fabric, so it makes more sense to press toward the base. And as always, we flip and we press from the right side with plenty of steam. And see how stitching close to the intersection of threads gives us this beautiful point right there. That's what we're going for. We want to leave our 1/4 inch seam allowances here, so we've got plenty of room for joining our units later, and preserve these points as much as we can. So they're all done. Now I'm going to organize them according to the diagram and the pattern. And there's some flexibility here. Good quilting technique. We can always come back and check our sizes, make sure that everything really is. Look at that. 6.5 inches. Look, it's even right through the middle. So nice. All right, everything's ready to go. Got our flying geese lined up. And again, we're working in quadrants, so it's these two go together to make a row, these two go together to make a row, and then row to row. If I were to quiz you and ask you, when I sew this row and I sew this row, how do I press my seam allowances, what would you answer? Opposite directions, right? That way we can nest our seams. If I were to ask you, when I stitch this seam, where do I want my stitches to land? See where this seam comes and it's going to intersect there? That's my 1/4 inch intersection. You can pin that to mark it for yourself so that as you sew the two units together into your row, you can preserve these points. See how not only have I pressed my seam allowances toward the base again to reduce the bulk here, but it allows them to, whoopsie, that way, to nest so that as I put my two rows together, I can nest those seams right there at the center, pop a pin in, and get a really beautiful final finish. This is our final seam in this quilt block. If you haven't noticed already, you'll see that there is a real process to making these blocks that is consistent. So even if you don't make the same design for every block, you very frequently will make rows and then combine the rows into the final block, or make units that are a segment of the block. So in this case, we're going to take our 8 pieces, sew them together to make 4 pieces, sew those together to make 2 rows, and then make 1 block. That the assembly of each block follows a very predictable pattern. And the more quilting you do, the more you'll start to see that there are elements of the instructions that you don't have to read super closely. You can kind of skim as you go along. This can help make your quilting more pleasurable and also more efficient. I will caution you though, A lot of us have run into opportunities to learn a new technique that we missed because we assumed we already knew how to do it and we didn't read the instructions thoroughly. So anytime you get a new quilt pattern, I do encourage you really to take the time as you're beginning to read all the way through to the end of the instructions and give yourself a chance to learn something that maybe you didn't know how to do before, an easier way, a faster way, a more efficient way, a method with less waste, or maybe just something that you enjoy more. And there we go, a finished Flying Geese quilt block ready for your quilt. Check your measurements. Trim off any excess, and you can set it aside until we're ready to assemble. You can see right here, that 6-inch mark should be the center of my block, and this diagonal line more or less aligns, so I can safely trim off the edges and know that my block measures 12.5 inches by 12.5 inches and is going to be just the right size for my quilt. I love the Flying Geese block. I think it's a really beautiful, classic, simple block that tends to go together fairly quickly. When you look at the last 3 blocks that we did working with triangles, we made the Ohio Star block, we made the card trick block, we made the Flying Geese block. All of those make triangles that have one right corner. There are other triangles in the world though, if you flash back to geometry, and I try not to. And we're going to work on those in the next episode of How to Quilt, when we make half rectangle triangles. I'll see you then.